In the snow country of old Japan, a Zen monk lived alone in a tiny mountain hut with almost nothing to his name. One night, a thief broke in to steal from him and found there was nothing worth taking at all. What happened next became one of the gentlest, most beloved stories in Japanese history. Tonight, let's drift slowly into the quiet life of a monk who owned almost nothing and somehow seemed to have everything he needed. Let's begin in a small harbor village called Izumozaki on the western coast of Japan in the year 1758. This was a place that lived by the rhythm of the sea and the gold trade. Ships came and went constantly, carrying ore mined from an island just offshore toward the distant capital, and the village headman's household sat near the center of all that quiet, steady commerce. It was into this household that a boy named Eizo was born, the eldest son of a man who was, by the standards of the time, remarkably accomplished, a shipping agent, the village headman, a Shinto priest, and, in his spare hours, a haiku poet. It was, in many ways, a household built for confidence and ambition, a family expected to produce a capable heir, someone who could step smoothly into managing ships, settling local disputes, and overseeing the modest religious duties that came with being both village headman and Shinto priest at once. Eldest sons in households like this rarely had the luxury of choosing an entirely different path for themselves. The role was simply waiting for them, the way it had waited for their fathers before them. You might expect a boy born into a household like that to grow up loud, ambitious, eager to inherit his father's many responsibilities. Eizo was, for the most part, the opposite. By every account that survives him, he was a quiet child, thoughtful, more interested in sitting with a book than running through the harbor with the other village children. At 11, he was already deep into the study of both Japanese and Chinese classical literature, the kind of education usually reserved for households with much grander ambitions than running a shipping business in a small coastal town. There is, interestingly, a brief and rather human exception to this picture of quiet bookishness. Some accounts of his youth describe a short period as he moved into his later teenage years when he showed every sign of becoming a fairly ordinary, even somewhat reckless young man about town, drawn for a while toward gambling and the company of women, the kind of restless behavior any number of young men of his era might have drifted into. It's a small detail easy to overlook in a life that would soon turn so completely towards simplicity and renunciation. But it's worth keeping in mind because it makes what happened next feel less like the inevitable destiny of an unusually saintly child and more like a real, complicated young man arriving, through some private crisis we don't have full details of, at a decision to change his entire life's direction. Whatever exactly happened inside him, by his late teenage years something had shifted deeply and permanently. The records describe it only vaguely as a kind of spiritual crisis, the specific cause lost to time, but the result was unmistakable. A young man who had been edging toward an ordinary, unremarkable provincial life chose instead to renounce nearly everything that life would have offered him. When he was 15, his father did what most fathers in his position would have done. He brought his son into the family business, hoping the boy would eventually take over the many roles he himself held. It did not go well. Whatever quiet brilliance Eizo possessed for poetry and philosophy, it simply didn't translate into trade or local governance. He struggled, made mistakes, and earned himself an unflattering nickname from people in the village, Hiru Andon, which translates gently but unmistakably to something like a lantern burning uselessly in broad daylight, a kind, old-fashioned way of calling someone a bit of a fool.
Some later accounts suggest his decision may have been influenced, at least in part, by a difficult relationship with another senior figure at the temple, an abbot whose more rigid, hierarchical approach to running a monastery sat uneasily alongside Ryōkan's own growing preference for simplicity and direct, unmediated spiritual practice over administrative duty. Whatever the precise mixture of reasons, the underlying instinct feels consistent with everything else we know about him. Temple life, with its formal duties, its administrative responsibilities, its expectations of leadership and management, simply didn't interest him. Instead, Ryōkan set out on foot, alone, beginning roughly 5 years of pilgrimage that carried him across Japan with no fixed home at all. It's worth slowing down on these wandering years because although very little detailed record of them survives, what does remain paints a quietly difficult, almost lonely picture, one that makes everything that came afterward feel even more meaningful by contrast. He carried almost nothing, a robe, a begging bowl, a walking staff. He slept wherever shelter could be found, sometimes in abandoned temples, sometimes in the kind of rough mountain huts no one else wanted, relying entirely on the charity of strangers for his next meal, which was not always forthcoming. One of his own poems from this period captures the mood plainly enough. A bowl and a flask in his hand, walking any distance, begging, and admitting without any self-pity that his robe had worn through to tatters and that he carried not a single coin. Later scholars who studied his writing from these years have suggested that this 5-year stretch may genuinely have been among the darkest and most uncertain of his entire life, not dramatic in any narrative sense, simply hard in the quiet, grinding way that poverty and homelessness are hard. During these wandering years, 2 pieces of difficult news reached him from home. His mother died while he was still deep in his monastic training, and then, not long into his pilgrimage, his father died as well, in the city of Kyoto. Ryōkan made his way there to see to his father's funeral rites himself, a son's quiet, necessary duty performed in the middle of an otherwise rootless, wandering existence. He visited his father's grave again later and wrote of the experience with the kind of simple, unguarded grief that runs through so much of his poetry. Pouring water over the tombstone, offering a silent prayer, the sun disappearing behind the hill, and a flood of tears soaking his sleeves, that he found, try as he might, that he simply could not hold back. It was also somewhere in these wandering years that Ryōkan seems to have first encountered the poetry of Han Shan, an eccentric Chinese hermit poet from many centuries earlier, often known in Japanese as Kanzan. Han Shan's verses, written from his own mountain retreat called Cold Mountain, spoke of the same kind of voluntary poverty, the same preference for nature and solitude over status and comfort that Ryōkan himself was beginning to feel his way toward. He would later write that he kept a volume of Han Shan's Cold Mountain poems inside his own hermitage, copying out the verses by hand and posting them around his walls, savoring each one again and again, treating them, in his own words, as better company than any formal scripture.
It would have been easy at this point for the story to end quietly and sadly, with a young man trapped in a life that clearly didn't fit him. Instead, at 18, Aizo made a decision that would reshape the rest of his life. He left his father's business behind and entered a small Zen temple called Koshoji to begin training as a monk. He took on a new name there, the way Buddhist monks traditionally did, Ryōkan, and later gave himself an additional title that he would carry with visible affection for the rest of his life: Daigu, Great Fool. In the language he used to explain it himself, the name combined three simple ideas: something good, something broad or expansive, and a deliberate, chosen foolishness, together forming a kind of identity that was at once humble and quietly proud, a man content to be thought a fool by the wider world as long as it meant genuine freedom underneath. It's worth sitting with that choice of name for a moment, because it tells you almost everything about the kind of person Ryōkan was about to become. He wasn't claiming wisdom or holiness or special spiritual achievement. He was, quite deliberately, embracing foolishness, the same word the villagers had once used to mock him, and turning it gently inside out into something closer to freedom. A teacher who knew him well once described him this way, that he looked like a fool but lived an entirely liberated life, playing freely with his own fate, unbothered by the things that tied other people down. For the next 12 years, Ryōkan trained seriously and patiently under a Zen master named Kokusen, first at Koshoji and later at Entutsuji in a different province entirely. These were not easy, leisurely years. Zen training of this kind involved long hours of seated meditation, simple food, simple lodging, and the slow, demanding work of learning to sit quietly with one's own mind. The decision to follow Kokusen to Entutsuji was itself a meaningful one. Ryōkan had been deeply impressed by the older master's quiet, dignified demeanor on a visit to Koshoji, impressed enough to personally request permission to become his disciple and leave behind the temple where he'd first taken his vows, traveling with him instead to an entirely different province to continue his training properly. What exactly those 12 years looked like day to day is mostly lost to us now, the way so much of any quiet, disciplined life tends to be. We know only the broad shape of it, long stretches of formal meditation, the patient study of Zen texts and koans, the kind of slow, repetitive spiritual labor that rarely produces dramatic stories, but quietly reshapes a person from the inside out. It seems to have suited him. By most accounts, Ryōkan was a diligent, devoted student throughout, eventually achieving what Zen tradition calls satori, a moment of direct spiritual awakening, and receiving formal recognition of that attainment from his teacher in the form of what's called an inka, a kind of certificate confirming he had truly grasped the heart of his master's teaching. And then, when Kokusen died the following year, Ryōkan was offered something many monks would have considered the natural reward for a decade of dedicated training, the chance to inherit his own temple and become its head. He turned it down.
It's a small theme, perhaps, but worth noticing. A man who had walked away from formal temple life, who had no permanent teacher correcting his understanding day to day, still chose to surround himself with the words of another hermit who had lived and died many centuries earlier on the other side of the sea in an entirely different language. Whatever Ryōkan was searching for in those difficult wandering years, he seems to have recognized something of it already worked out long before his own birth in the quiet verses of a stranger who had faced down the same loneliness, the same poverty, the same slow unraveling of worldly ambition, and apparently found his way through to something resembling peace on the other side. It was perhaps the closest thing to reassurance available to a young monk with no fixed home and no certainty about where his life was actually heading. By the time these 5 wandering years drew to a close, Ryōkan was approaching 40, his health already showing signs of the hardship he'd endured, his father gone, his mother gone, with no fixed home anywhere in Japan and no temple of his own. And it was at this point, rather than seeking out comfort or stability, that he made his way back to the snow country where he'd been born and quietly built a life that, on paper, looked almost identical to the hardship he'd just spent 5 years living through. The difference was that this time it was entirely his own choice, made with his eyes fully open and made, it seems, with something close to relief. He called this little hut Go-Go-An, the 5-scoop hut, named after the small daily ration of rice its previous occupant had once been allotted. It was about as humble a home as you could imagine. Thick forest pressed in close around it, weeds grew across the path leading to its door, so dense that, as Ryōkan himself once wrote, only those who had genuinely lost their way ever happened to find it. It was here, deep in this quiet, overgrown corner of the mountain, that Ryōkan would spend the better part of the next several decades of his life. His days followed no rigid schedule, no formal temple bell calling him to prayer or duty. He woke when he woke, he meditated, he gathered firewood from the forest around his hut, carrying it home the way any poor mountain dweller might. Several times a week he walked down into the surrounding villages to beg quietly for food, the traditional practice of takuhatsu, not out of desperation, but as a deliberate, accepted part of a monk's simple life, a way of staying gently connected to the ordinary people around him, rather than withdrawing entirely from the world. These rounds did not always go well, and Ryōkan was honest enough in his poetry to admit it plainly. There were days he dragged himself from village to village with no luck at all, only to find himself by sunset miles of mountain still standing between him and his own small hut. When he wasn't gathering wood or begging, much of his time went into 2 quiet, patient practices that defined the rhythm of his solitary days: meditation and calligraphy. He brushed characters onto paper almost every morning of his life, and the habit ran so deep that even while walking on his begging rounds with nothing to write on, he would sometimes trace characters in the air with his finger or in the dirt of the road with his foot, simply for the quiet pleasure of the motion itself. It's a small, oddly touching image, a grown man alone on a forest path, drawing invisible words into empty air for no audience at all except himself.
He once wrote almost dismissively of his own considerable poetry that these poems were not really poems at all, and that only once a reader understood this could they begin to speak of poetry properly, a typically playful, self-deflating way of refusing to take even his own considerable talent too seriously.
This habit eventually made him something of a local treasure even during his own lifetime. Villagers who gave him food, tobacco, or rice wine could generally expect a piece of his calligraphy in return, brushed out simply and freely, and these small, unassuming gifts came over the years to be treasured well beyond his own quiet province. There's a particularly charming story passed down about a local shopkeeper who once asked him for something plain enough that an ordinary, uneducated person could actually read it, rather than the elegant, flowing classical characters scholars usually requested. Ryōkan, apparently delighted rather than offended by the request, simply wrote out the most basic building blocks of the Japanese writing system, the equivalent of A, B, C, followed by the numbers 1, 2, 3. Centuries later, these two unpretentious little pieces of calligraphy are counted among the most treasured examples of the entire art form in Japan, a strange and lovely testament to how little Ryōkan himself seems to care about impressing anyone, even while accidentally creating masterpieces. His relationship with the natural world around his hut ran just as deep and just as plainly through his poetry. He kept a small garden at Go-Go-On, filled with the kind of modest, unfussy plants any mountain hermit might gather: bush clover, wild grasses, violets, dandelions, morning glories, asters, daylilies, and wrote in one particularly tender poem of cherishing them morning and evening, watering them, protecting them from the harsh sun, watching them grow into what everyone around him agreed was a genuinely beautiful little garden. And then, in the same poem, almost without warning, a violent early summer storm tore through one evening, battering and ruining the plants entirely, pounding them down into the mud. There's no bitterness in how Ryōkan wrote about this loss, no anger directed at the unfairness of it, simply a quiet, plain record that it happened, the way storms happen to gardens, the way loss happens to anyone who loves something growing and alive. It's worth pausing on that small, unremarkable storm for a moment, because it says something true about Ryōkan's whole approach to life. He didn't write his poetry to complain about hardship or to celebrate triumph over it. He wrote simply to notice things: a ruined garden, an empty begging bowl, a child's game, a friend's grave, rain on a window, and let each small moment exist honestly on the page without dressing it up into something grander than it actually was. And it's here that some of the warmest, most enduring stories about him begin. He had, by all accounts, an almost bottomless fondness of the company of children. Villagers would later remember him dropping whatever task he'd been in the middle of, gathering wood, walking somewhere with purpose, the moment he spotted children playing nearby, joining in immediately with games of tag, hide-and-seek, or a traditional cloth ball game called temari, bouncing the little ball while singing along with the children's counting songs. He was more than once so thoroughly absorbed in playing that he simply forgot to continue on his begging rounds entirely, content instead to spend the whole day picking flowers alongside the village children rather than worrying about where his next meal might come from. He treated farmers and fishermen with the same easy warmth. He was known to sit and drink with local farmers, to dance at village festivals, to write little blessings or simple poems in exchange for rice when he had nothing else to offer. There's a particularly vivid image of him from these years, recorded in his own poetry. Walking about with his staff in the height of midsummer, when old farmers working the fields would spot him passing by and call him over for a drink. They would sit together in the open fields, using broad leaves in place of proper plates, and Ryōkan, by his own cheerful admission, often ended these afternoons pleasantly drunk, drifting off to sleep sprawled out contentedly along the bank between rice paddies, with nowhere urgent to be and no one expecting him back at any particular hour.
When one farmer, unable to read elegant calligraphy, asked him plainly for something he could actually understand instead of fancy symbols, Ryōkan, rather than taking offense, seems to have simply found the moment amusing, the way he found most of life amusing. He also held a quiet, genuine respect for the labor of ordinary farming life that ran deeper than simple friendliness. During planting and harvest seasons, he would sometimes paint small pictures of farmers at work and hang them inside his hut, treating the images almost like a small shrine, leaving offerings of incense and flowers beside them, a private, personal way of honoring the patient labor that fed everyone around him, including himself, turning, as he once wrote, a single grain of rice into many through nothing but sustained, unglamorous effort. This respect occasionally carried a quieter, more pointed edge as well. The local feudal lord of the region was known to enjoy hunting and would sometimes insist on it during the busiest harvest weeks, requiring local farmers to abandon their own urgent work in the fields to clear roads for his hunting party instead. Ryōkan, encountering villagers forced into this thankless extra labor on one such occasion, seems to have quietly noted the unfairness of it in his own writing, sympathizing plainly with people whose hard-won harvest time was being interrupted for someone else's leisure. A small, gentle act of solidarity from a man who owned nothing himself, directed toward people who had comparatively very little to spare either. There's one particular memory from his years on Mount Kugami that captures his character almost perfectly. The local feudal lord, hearing of Ryōkan's growing reputation as a wise and gentle monk, traveled up the mountain personally to meet him, hoping to convince him to take charge of a newly built temple as its formal abbot. When the lord's party arrived, Ryōkan wasn't even home. He was out in the hills gathering flowers, as he so often was, and the visitors had no choice but to wait patiently until he wandered back, arms full of fragrant blossoms he'd gathered along the way. The lord made his generous offer. Ryōkan said nothing in response. Instead, he simply picked up a brush, wrote a short poem on a scrap of paper, and handed it over in place of an answer. There was no need for him to explain further. The poem said everything his silence meant to say, that this small, overgrown hut and the freedom it offered him was worth more to him than any formal title or grand temple ever could be. A handful of smaller stories, passed down by villagers who'd actually known him, round out the picture of just how relaxed and unbothered Ryōkan's relationship with the world's usual rules tended to be. Strict Buddhist custom generally called for monks to abstain from eating meat or fish, but when a young monk once watched him eat fish that had been offered to him and asked why, Ryōkan answered simply that he ate it gladly when it was given, the same way he let fleas and flies feast on him at night without complaint. Neither one bothered him in the slightest. He also disliked wasting any food at all, however small, and would keep leftover scraps in a little pot rather than throw them away, even after they'd started to spoil and grow thick with insects. When a worried visitor warned him against eating from it, Ryōkan simply reassured them with what was apparently complete sincerity that he always let the insects escape first and that it tasted perfectly fine afterward. There's something genuinely endearing, too, in the story of the Bon Festival, the midsummer celebration when the spirits of the dead were traditionally welcomed home with food, music, and slow communal dancing. As a monk, Ryōkan technically had no business attending such a worldly, festive occasion at all. So, by more than one account, he simply disguised himself as a woman and slipped into the festivities anyway, dancing late into the night alongside the very farmers and villagers.
A thief slipped inside, hoping to find something worth stealing, but there was almost nothing there at all. Ryōkan owned, essentially, a single blanket, which he used both day and night, and very little else besides. Rather than waking in alarm, Ryōkan seems to have felt something closer to quiet sympathy for the man. Here was someone who had gone to the trouble of breaking into a hut in the middle of the night, only to discover there was nothing worth the risk he'd taken. So Ryōkan simply gave him the one thing he did have. He handed the thief his own blanket and let him go on his way. Afterwards, sitting alone in his now nearly empty hut with nothing left to cover himself, Ryōkan looked out at the night sky and wrote a short poem about the moon shining through his window, gently wishing that he could have given the thief that too. It's a small, almost playful story on its surface, but it captures something genuinely deep about how Ryōkan understood the world. The blanket could be taken, the moonlight could not. Of everything in the natural world, the moon seems to have held a particularly special place in Ryōkan's affection, appearing again and again throughout his poetry as a quiet, constant companion. He wrote of sitting alone late at night, taking up his walking staff and stepping outside under a clear sky, of moonlight falling through tangled vines along a winding pebble path, of feeling, in certain rare, expansive moments, almost like a crane himself, floating somewhere above the clouds. There's a particular tenderness in how often the moon appears in his writing, precisely during his loneliest passages, the nights with no visitors, no conversation, nothing but the sound of falling leaves and his own quiet breathing in an empty hut. It's as though the moon became for him proof that solitude was never quite the same thing as true emptiness. Something was always there, watching gently back. The changing seasons themselves seem to have mattered as much as any single companion, human or otherwise. He wrote of arriving at a village just as the peach blossoms reached full bloom, their red petals reflecting in the river below. He wrote of autumn evenings spent gathering firewood, burning dried leaves sparingly in his small hearth to save fuel, noticing, almost in passing, that moss had quietly begun growing across the shoulders of his own robe, a small, plain image of a man so settled into stillness that even moss had time to take hold of him. He wrote of harsh, snow-bound winters when the village river beneath his mountain, usually heard rather than seen, fell utterly silent under the ice, and of the particular specific ache of those long, isolated months, made bearable mostly by an old volume of poetry and the patient company of his own thoughts. There's a wonderful, very human honesty running through these seasonal poems that keeps them from ever feeling like simple nature postcards. In one, he openly admitted that on rainy days he simply felt sorry for himself, with no attempt to dress the feeling up as some deeper spiritual lesson. In another, recalling his now distant youth on a winter night, he wondered, almost wistfully, whether he had ever truly been young at all, or whether the memory itself was closer to a half-remembered dream. This is in many ways the quiet secret of why Ryōkan's poetry has lasted as long as it has, far beyond the borders of the province where he actually lived his entire modest life. He never pretended to have transcended ordinary human feeling. He simply sat with it plainly and wrote it down exactly as it was. Lonely sometimes, amused sometimes, occasionally between, content far more often than either.
As the years passed and Ryōkan grew older, his health gradually made the cold, steep winters of Mount Kugami harder to manage. Around his 60th birthday, he moved down to a gentler cabin closer to the surrounding villages, and then, roughly 8 years after that, his health declining further still, he was forced to move once more, this time into a small dwelling on the estate of a wealthy and devoted patron named Kimura Motoweomon in a place called Shimazaki. By his own account, Ryōkan felt almost like a caged bird in this final, more comfortable home. A man who had spent decades choosing freedom over comfort, now needing to accept exactly the kind of settled, supported life he'd avoided for most of his adult years. It was here, around 1826 or 1827, already approaching 70 years old, that Ryōkan finally met the companion he seems to have quietly longed for throughout so much of his solitary life. Her name was Teishin. She had been born in Nagaoka in 1798, the daughter of a samurai family, and as a young woman of 17, she had married a physician. The marriage didn't last. The precise reason isn't entirely clear from surviving records, whether illness, separation, or simply an unhappy match that ended without children. But sometime afterward, Teishin took vows as a Buddhist nun and began building a quiet life of her own around poetry, calligraphy, and religious practice, not entirely unlike the life Ryōkan himself had built decades earlier. When she finally came to visit him, drawn by his growing reputation, she was 26 or 27 years old, 4 decades younger than the elderly monk she'd come to meet. By every account that survives, that very first meeting left both of them quietly delighted with each other, the start of a closeness that would go on to genuinely brighten what remained of Ryōkan's life. They began exchanging poems back and forth almost immediately, a tradition of linked verse and gentle correspondence that Japanese poets had practiced for centuries, and over these final years they walked together through the surrounding fields and villages whenever Ryōkan's health allowed it, talking for long hours about literature, about religion, about the small, ordinary texture of each other's days. It would be easy, looking back from a much more modern vantage point, to wonder exactly how to categorize what existed between them, student and teacher, dear friends, perhaps something closer to love, or perhaps some gentle combination of all three that doesn't translate neatly into any single modern label. Teishin herself became his close companion, his caregiver, and by some accounts his only true literary disciple, the one person who understood both his poetry and his temperament well enough to actually capture them faithfully for everyone who came after. Whatever the precise nature of their bond, Ryōkan's own writing from these final years speaks to it with unmistakable warmth. In one simple, often quoted verse, he described their relationship as two people sharing one heart, and in another, he wrote of the two of them dreaming together, lightly, almost playfully, content simply to let the dream continue on as long as either of them wished. When Ryōkan's health finally began to fail in earnest, it was Teishin who stayed by him and cared for him through his last days, the way she'd quietly cared for him through much of those final years already. According to her own later writings, he died early in the morning on the 6th day of January, 2831, seated upright in meditation posture, passing away, in her words, as gently and naturally as if he were simply falling asleep. Just before the end, he is said to have offered him a final poem, comparing himself with characteristic gentleness to an autumn leaf, turning to show first one side, then the other, before finally, quietly, falling.
It's worth pausing on that image for a long moment, because it feels like such a fitting final picture for a man who had spent his entire life choosing simplicity over ambition, presence over possession, and quiet attention over hurried achievement. He left behind no temple of his own, no official disciples carrying his teachings forward in any institutional sense. What he left behind instead were poems, thousands of them, written in both Japanese and Chinese, many of them small, plain, unpretentious records of an entirely ordinary day, gathering firewood, walking through snow, watching children play, missing a friend, simply sitting quietly and listening to rainfall outside his hut. It was Teishin herself, in the years following his death, who gathered many of these poems together into a collection she called Hachisu no Tsuyu, Dew on the Lotus, preserving for the rest of the world a voice that might otherwise have remained known only to a handful of villagers, farmers, and children on one quiet, overgrown mountainside. The collection included not only Ryōkan's own poems, but a small, quietly moving record of two people who had found each other late in life and made the most of whatever time remained. Without Teishin's careful devotion to that task, it's entirely possible Ryōkan's name and his gentle, foolish wisdom would have simply faded away with the generation who'd actually known him, remembered, if at all, as one more eccentric local hermit among countless others scattered across Japan's mountains and provinces. Instead, his story did something rather remarkable. It traveled, slowly and steadily, well beyond that one small province, until it became something close to a shared piece of the Japanese national imagination. It's worth pausing here on what exactly people found so enduringly appealing about him, because it wasn't really his formal Buddhist teaching. Ryōkan left behind no great doctrinal treatise, founded no lasting school of thought, trained no chain of formal successors the way many of the most famous Zen masters did. What he left behind instead was something simpler and in some ways harder to imitate, a single consistent example of someone who appeared to have genuinely stopped wanting more than he already had. He once wrote with characteristic plainness that he was simply a fool living among trees and plants, and asked not to be questioned about illusion or enlightenment at all, that he merely liked to smile quietly to himself. He wrote of wading across streams on bony, aging legs, of carrying a simple bag through fine spring weather, content that the world, in his own words, owed him absolutely nothing. This particular kind of contentment seems to have struck a chord that has only grown louder with time, rather than fading the way so much historical memory eventually does. Surveys taken in more recent decades have found that the overwhelming majority of Japanese school children still grow up knowing at least one or two stories about him: the thief and the blanket, the lord and the flowers, the monk who would rather play hide-and-seek with village children than hurry along to his next obligation. He appears in children's books, in museum exhibits, in motivational writing aimed at adults exhausted by a far busier, far more demanding modern world than the one he ever lived in. There is something almost ironic and rather lovely in the fact that a society now often described as fast-paced, crowded, and intensely focused on productivity and achievement has, if anything, grown even more fond of a man whose entire philosophy amounted to owning almost nothing, hurrying towards nothing, and today his old hermitage on Mount Kugami still stands, carefully preserved, and quiet visitors continue to climb that same overgrown mountain path every year, the way pilgrims do, looking for some small trace of the stillness he seemed to carry within himself so naturally. His tomb rests in Shimazaki, near the patron's estate where he spent his final years, and in Izumazaki a small museum keeps his calligraphy and his memory carefully tended, a quiet counterpart to the busy harbor that once produced a boy nobody quite expected to amount to very much. At Ensuji, the temple where he first attained his deepest spiritual breakthrough under his teacher Kokusen, a modest statue now honors him as well, fittingly unassuming for a man who refused again and again throughout his life every honor anyone tried to formally bestow on him. What lingers longest after everything else about this story fades isn't really any single anecdote. It's the quality the people who actually knew Ryōkan kept returning to whenever they tried to describe him in their own writing. One contemporary who'd known him personally in his youth wrote that he carried a kind of lofty, naturally expressed spirit, tall and slender, with the unhurried bearing of an old Taoist sage. Another, describing him in his last years, put it even simply, that the master never displayed excessive joy or anger, that no one ever heard him speak in a hurried manner, and that in everything he did, eating, drinking, rising in the morning, settling down at night, His movements carried the same slow, easy quality, as though hurry itself were a habit he had quietly, deliberately let go of, long before most people even notice they're carrying it. There's a particular comfort in sitting with a life shaped this way, especially at the end of a long day, with your own mind perhaps still half tangled in everything it didn't manage to finish. Ryōkan never finished much of anything in the way the wider world usually measures finishing. He left no temple, no formal students carrying his name into the future, no great architectural monument, no famous expedition, no lasting institution bearing his stamp. He left a small overgrown hut on a mountainside, a single blanket he gave away without hesitation, a garden ruined by one bad storm and replanted without complaint, and several thousand short, plain poems about firewood, snow, children's games, and old friend's grave, and the particular quality of moonlight falling through a half-open window. And somehow that turned out to be more than enough to outlast him by nearly 200 years. Perhaps that's the quiet lesson underneath everything else in this story, if it needs one at all. Ryōkan never set out to build something permanent. He set out, as best we can tell, simply to be present for each ordinary day as it arrived, the good begging rounds and the unsuccessful ones, the warm festival nights and the long silent winters, the children's games and the empty hut waiting for him afterwards. He had nowhere else he urgently needed to be, and nothing he urgently needed to acquire, because he had already quietly decided, sometime in that small hut on Mount Kugami, that what he already had, however little it amounted to in worldly terms, was simply enough. If gentle stories like this one help carry you towards sleep, you know what to do. Tap that like button before you drift off, hit subscribe so the next story finds its way to you, and turn on notifications so you never miss a quiet night with the sleeping historian. Sleep well, and we'll see you on the next journey through history.